Right, let's unpack this. Tonight, we are wading into one of the most disturbing and, frankly, legally confounding cases in modern history.
It's a truly chilling file, and one that really highlights the limitations of justice itself.
Our deep dive today is defined by a terrifying contradiction. I mean, the enormous gap between the worst suspicions a nation can have about one person and the cold, hard certainty of legal proof.
We're investigating the case of Leszek Pękalski, born in 1966, known ominously as the Vampire of Bytów.
The Vampire of Bytów.
Yeah, and the core narrative here is how an investigation struggled desperately to find solid forensic ground during a period of just intense institutional upheaval in Poland.
The timeline itself is so vital for understanding the chaos. His suspected crime spanned from 1984 to 1992. And for anyone listening who might not be familiar with the recent history of Eastern Europe, you have to understand this isn't just a random 8-year period.
Not at all.
This is Poland moving from late communism, when centralized control was, well, absolute, but often inefficient, through the incredibly tumultuous post-Soviet transition.
An era of political, social, and critically governmental fragmentation.
Right. And the instability of that era, it seems to be mirrored precisely in the sheer lack of verifiable evidence for what he was suspected of doing.
What's so fascinating here is the sheer scale of the allegation just colliding with a legal system that was struggling to modernize.
And to collect evidence across different jurisdictions.
Exactly. Pękalski became notorious not just for the crimes he was eventually charged with, but for the shocking numbers he initially threw out himself.
Right, the confessions.
We are talking about a suspected serial killer, believed by the authorities to have killed at least 17 people. But the chilling notoriety stems from his own retracted admissions.
Which were what?
Confessions that range from 70 to 90 victims.
70 to 90?
Yes. Yet after years of intense police work, he was convicted of only one single murder.
One conviction out of a potential 90 alleged crimes. That gap is just staggering and immediately sets the atmosphere of dread for this deep dive.
It tells us that the state knew they likely had a monster, a man responsible for mass killings, but they simply couldn't build the coordinated forensic case required to hold him accountable.
Not for the full scope of his alleged terror.
No?
So our mission today is to understand the legal, social, and historical reasons why. We're drawing from biographical and legal summaries that document his crimes, his arrest, and his enduring status as a high-risk individual who, even now, years after his sentence formally ended, remains detained by the state.
Mm-hmm.
To understand the darkness this man inflicted, we really have to look first at the soil from which he grew.
His early life.
Yes, this wasn't just a difficult childhood. It was a deeply fractured one, which is absolutely essential context for our listeners who may not be familiar with the social rigidity and poverty of rural Poland during the late Cold War period.
Definitely. Leszek Pękalski was born in Osieki near Bytów, Poland in 1966.
And his background, it reads like a catalog of profound neglect and systemic vulnerability.
It really does. His mother, Cecilia Pękalska, was documented as a farm worker, and she suffered from severe alcoholism. She died relatively young in 1988.
And that's only 4 years after Pękalski's alleged crime spree even began.
Exactly. And, crucially, he was born an illegitimate child, a twin with a sister, and was, by all accounts, largely neglected by his mother throughout his entire formative years.
And you have to stress, being an illegitimate child in that time and place, especially in a conservative rural community, that carried a heavy social stigma.
Oh, absolutely. It goes far beyond what we might understand today.
He wasn't just marginalized. He was defined by his otherness from the very start, and stability was
Non-existent. He was shuffled between care, initially spending time in a children's home, then with his grandmother, and eventually with an uncle.
So no stable attachment, no consistent nurturing structure. It's a pervasive thread we find in the biographies of severe violence-prone offenders.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, his early life was marked by social isolation, but it was compounded by a medical factor.
The diagnosis.
Yes. Pękalski was diagnosed as lekko-uposażony, which translates to lightly disabled from birth, and he received a state pension because of this intellectual disability.
So this diagnosis, combined with his deeply fractured home life, what did that do?
It ensured consistent toxic social rejection.
Mm.
He simply could not integrate into his community. He was an outsider because of his background and because of his intellectual differences.
This vulnerability must have created a tragic feedback loop.
It did. He was noted as being profoundly unsuccessful in his attempts to find a wife or build any sort of stable, meaningful adult relationship.
So this isolation, this perpetual feeling of being outside the community looking in, it must have fueled immense resentment and rage.
Tragically, it seems to have provided the pathway for him to seek a perverse, violent sense of control later in his life.
And that leukoupysledzony diagnosis is so vital because it speaks not only to his social standing, but also, potentially, to his suggestibility.
And the reliability of his later extensive confessions. Yes, absolutely.
We have a portrait of a man who was, in a psychological sense, already a ghost long before he became a notorious criminal.
Untethered, rejected, and moving around without anyone taking deep notice of his whereabouts or his patterns.
And this leads directly to the third factor that defined his opportunity: his transient lifestyle.
His nomadic tendency.
It was undoubtedly the primary factor that allowed him to operate across such a vast geographic area, multiple regions, or voivodeships as they're called in Poland, and evade capture for so long.
Especially during a time of institutional flux.
Exactly.
The sources detail his unsettling behavior right before his arrest. He had an obsessive love for riding trains.
Just riding trains.
Yes, often spending days doing nothing but moving across the country. He had a habit of disappearing from home for days on end, often sleeping simply in the woods, without ever disclosing his location when he came back.
So this nomadic existence, hopping trains and staying outdoors, effectively turned him into an untraceable phantom.
During a crucial period, yes.
And here we have to pause and emphasize the historical context again. This happened primarily in the late 1980s and early 1990s.
Right in the middle of that transition.
And during this transition, police infrastructure and communication across different regions of Poland were fragmented, localized, and often poorly funded.
There was no integrated national database. No swift way for a small regional police department investigating a missing woman in the north to connect that to a separate cold case rape in the south.
Especially if the perpetrator was a transient, lightly disabled man whom no one was actively looking for on a national level.
He was moving, and the police structure was too localized and fragmented to connect the dots quickly enough to stop him.
Okay, so now we step into the span of terror itself, which stretched for 8 years, from 1984 to 1992.
A long time.
A very long time. And before we even get to the famous murder conviction, it's important to establish Pękalski's early legal trouble. He was already on the radar for sexual violence before his final defining arrest.
That's a critical timeline detail. He was initially arrested and convicted in November 1992 for rape, a specific documented sexual assault. And he received a 2-year suspended sentence.
A suspended sentence.
A 2-year suspended sentence. Think about that for a moment.
It indicates that the violent sexual behavior was already escalating and consistent, yet the system at that point still viewed him as, what? A candidate for rehabilitation.
Or at least not requiring immediate, lengthy incarceration. It suggests the full extent of his danger just hadn't been grasped yet.
That suspended sentence is a glaring signpost of the system's initial failure to recognize the scale of the threat.
And then the case truly explodes onto the national scene.
Because of the confessions.
Exactly.
Cap.
Once he was arrested for a specific murder in December 1992, Pękalski started talking. And he didn't stop. He admitted to having killed as many as 80 people. Some sources even cite up to 90.
90 victims. If those numbers were even remotely true, he would immediately be classified among the most prolific serial murderers in modern history.
The horror, the sheer panic, and the media frenzy that must have engulfed Poland when those numbers were leaked. You can't overstate it.
It was a nation coming to terms with the darkness lurking within its own borders, a horror seemingly unchecked by the decaying state security apparatus. And this immediately brings us to the core legal and psychological mystery. Why would a suspect confess to 70, 80, or 90 murders, especially if only one could ultimately be proven?
This is where the case becomes so confusing and frankly chilling for both investigators and the public.
Because of his intellectual disability?
Yes, that leukoupysledzony status. These confessions could be highly unreliable. There are several psychological possibilities that investigators had to wrestle with.
Such as?
First, coercion. Second, suggestibility. A person with diminished capacity can be led to say what they think the interrogators want to hear, especially under the pressure of intense questioning.
And third?
A perverse desire for attention or notoriety. Exaggerating the crime count elevates his own pathetic, isolated standing in his own mind. Makes him feel powerful.
So the moment those confessions hit the police archives, it created an investigative nightmare.
A total nightmare. Police had to try and match Pękalski's confused, rambling, highly unreliable, and perhaps exaggerated statements to dozens of unsolved cold cases.
Across every single regional police department in the country, cases spanning 8 years.
And that investigative nightmare deepened almost immediately, because as quickly as he confessed, he later retracted all of these admissions.
So you just clammed up.
Completely. This created a massive, immediate evidentiary wall for the prosecution. You go from having the suspect claiming responsibility for potentially 90 victims, throwing the entire system into chaos,
to having a suspect who suddenly says, I didn't do anything, I was confused, I was pressured.
Right. And that retraction immediately renders the verbal statements virtually useless in court for most charges.
Unless investigators had independent physical corroboration.
Which is where the great historical tragedy of the Pękalski case lies. In Poland, in the early 1990s, a state emerging from decades of centralized command and control, operating with extremely limited forensic tools.
Compared to what we have now.
Exactly. Linking physical evidence across 8 years in multiple regional jurisdictions was an almost insurmountable task. The police structure had been decentralized, but not effectively modernized.
So forensics meant fingerprints and basic blood typing?
Not the sophisticated DNA analysis needed to connect a transient killer to decades-old cold cases spread over a vast geographical area. The system was simply not equipped to handle them.
So the focus had to shift entirely, from proving 80 or 90 to proving anything at all. The crucial legal moment came with his December 1992 arrest as a suspect in a very specific, defined case.
The murder of 17-year-old Celia.
Yes, the 1991 murder of Celia near the villages of Jeziers and Durakowo. This arrest finally gave the police a solid anchor point, a crime with relatively fresh evidence compared to the, say, 1984 and 1985 cold cases.
And this is where the deeper psychological and legal dive began. Following his arrest, expert evaluation commenced immediately. Psychiatrists observed him for several months.
Which resulted in the formal diagnosis.
Yes, the diagnosis of intellectual disability and accompanying sexual disorders. But while the disability complicated the reliability of his confessions, it didn't negate the possibility of his guilt.
So the courts had to undertake the difficult task of separating the man's psychological state, which explained why he might confess or why he struggled socially, from the actual physical evidence that proved his actions.
Exactly.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the police did have compelling evidence beyond the initial unreliable confessions.
They did.
This evidence came through specific investigative techniques that are legally significant in many European systems, notably the crime scene recreation.
Known in Poland as vigie local.
And these proved absolutely pivotal in establishing the single conviction.
They're not just walkthroughs. They are detailed, recorded reenactments where the suspect is brought to the site and asked to describe and demonstrate his actions.
And what happened during these recreations?
During these, Pękalski described in chilling, minute detail how he raped and murdered his victims.
But the key here, the thing that makes it actual evidence.
Critically, and this is the key to their power, he provided specific, unique, and verifiable details about the crime scenes, the victims, and the sequence of events that only the murderer could have known.
Things that weren't public knowledge.
Exactly. Details that matched the police reports perfectly.
So if he was able to provide these unimpeachable details for many alleged crimes during the vigie local, details that were independently verifiable, why the single conviction?
That is the defining question of the case.
Why couldn't they use these specific descriptions to prove the other 16 attempts the prosecution was aiming for, or even more?
And the answer lies squarely in the legal standard of proof colliding with historical reality. While Pękalski's statements in the vigie local strongly suggested guilt for multiple crimes, the Polish legal system, particularly after the political transition, required physical, forensic corroboration, a corpus delicti for a conviction.
Especially once the defendant formally retracts his statements in court.
Precisely. So the detailed confession about the murder back in 1985, however accurate it seemed, was insufficient on its own.
So the prosecution could only manage to formally prove the one murder.
The rape and killing of 17-year-old Celia near Jeziers. This case was relatively recent, from 1991, providing the strongest physical evidence base.
And the difficulty for the other, say, 79 cases was the historical context.
Lack of advanced DNA analysis, poor preservation of evidence across years in different police departments, and the sheer complexity of proving sequential crimes committed by a nomadic individual with diminished capacity, who then systematically denied everything in the courtroom.
If the police couldn't find that physical link, a specific, unique piece of trace evidence. The detailed confession, once retracted, was insufficient to meet the legal burden of proof for the other alleged victims.
The judge simply couldn't risk basing dozens of murder convictions entirely on the word of a man who was deemed intellectually disabled and who was actively denying those statements in court.
The outcome of the trial in 1996, then, reflects this enormous evidentiary struggle perfectly. Pękalski was convicted for the rape and murder of Celia and sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. And it bears repeating, while he was providing those precise, horrifying details during the investigation.
He retracted all of it, all his earlier explanations and confessions, once he was actually brought before the court.
That formal court retraction, undoubtedly advised by legal counsel, was the decisive tactical move that saved him from a potential life sentence for mass murder.
It was. Without his testimony and without the forensic breakthroughs needed to link him conclusively to the much older cold cases, the court was legally limited to the Celia case. It possessed the strongest and most recent physical and circumstantial link.
So let's analyze the sentencing paradox. Because Poland made a massive shift in its legal structure just before Pękalski's trial.
Right, the reinstatement of life imprisonment, do you see?
It had been reinstated in the Polish legal system in November 1995, just months before his 1996 sentencing.
The timing is incredibly instructive.
Yet he received 25 years, a definite, finite end to his incarceration. Why?
While life imprisonment was legally available to the judge in 1996, the decision to sentence Pękalski to 25 years instead of life highlights the severe constraints the court was operating under.
They had only definitively proven one murder.
Exactly. Imposing the most severe penalty, life imprisonment, for a conviction of a single crime, when the defendant's counsel could argue the evidence base was thin for any other offenses, might have been viewed as legally risky.
The defense could have appealed, arguing that the sentence was excessive given the single proven count.
Right.
So it sounds like the court chose the pragmatic route, securing the maximum possible unassailable sentence for the one provable offense, rather than risking an appeal on a life sentence that might have relied too heavily on uncorroborated, retracted confessions.
That's a very good way to put it. This decision secured the public safety for 25 years, but it certainly did not provide closure or justice for the majority of the families involved.
That is precisely the dark legacy. It was a compromise born out of legal constraint. It ensured his imprisonment, but simultaneously confirmed that a known, suspected serial killer could not be fully held accountable.
Not for the scale of his alleged crimes, no. Not with the state of Polish forensics and interregional police cooperation in that critical investigative period.
So regardless of the legal gymnastics, Pękalski was locked away. But the story does not end with his sentencing.
Not even close.
Because the fear of his eventual return never faded, a fear that has defined his post-conviction life.
The shadow of fear has been a constant feature of this case for over 2 decades. Pękalski spent his time serving his 25-year sentence primarily in the remand prison in Starogard Gdański.
And the system, along with the medical and psychological professionals monitoring him, recognized the inherent ongoing danger he continued to pose.
That inherent danger became starkly clear through the parole process. He was technically eligible for conditional early release starting in 2007.
And he applied.
He applied, as is his legal right, every single year thereafter.
Imagine the tension, the re-traumatization, and the anxiety for the surviving victims' families and the public every time his case came up for review.
And the system responded consistently and forcefully to that risk assessment. Every single year, a team of therapists, correctional experts, and medical professionals rejected his applications.
On what grounds?
They confirmed their professional assessment of his continuing high-level risk of violence and sexual offending. This highlights a deep professional consensus. Despite the limited conviction, the experts monitoring him believe he remained fundamentally broken and capable of immediate, violent reoffending.
So he never achieved conditional release.
Never.
Pękalski completed his full 25-year sentence and was legally released on December 11, 2017. But this was not a true release back into society.
Not at all. He was immediately transferred under a specific separate piece of Polish legislation to the National Center for the Prevention of Desocial Behavior in Gostynin.
Gostynin. We need to explain what this is.
Yes. Gostinnen represents the state's ultimate measure of public safety protection in these extreme cases. We have to clarify for the listener. Gostinnen is not a traditional prison, nor is it a standard psychiatric hospital.
It's something else entirely.
It is a specialized center established under a 2013 law to manage individuals who have completed their prison sentences, but are deemed, by medical evaluation, to pose an extremely high immediate risk to society due to severe psychological and sexual disorders that predispose them to violence.
So it's a form of preventive post-sentence civil detention.
That's exactly what it is.
This distinction is vital. He is no longer being punished for past crimes in Gostinnen. He's being detained to prevent future ones.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the current status of Pękalski within this specialized center? Is this indefinite detention?
It's a continuous, monitored, and legally reviewed process. He remains under strict court supervision, and the law mandates that he is evaluated by psychiatrists every 6 months.
Every 6 months.
Yes, and the court rigorously reviews these expert evaluations to determine whether the objective medical criteria for continued detention, specifically whether he remains a demonstrably immediate high-level threat, are still met.
And the fact that he remains there years after his formal sentence speaks volumes.
It does. It tells you everything about the professional consensus regarding his threat level. He is classified among the most dangerous individuals in Poland, legally detained for public safety.
And the sources, they paint a terrifying picture of the public and professional anxiety surrounding Pękalski's situation. Even confined in Gostinnen, the fear persists.
Indeed. One source quotes the profound, chilling fear that should he ever be released back into the general public,
What was the quote?
he might take revenge and properly take revenge. That's not just abstract public unease.
No, it's an acknowledgement of the sheer resentment and rage that a person convicted of only one crime, but widely believed to have committed dozens more, might harbor against the society and the system that confined him for 25 years and then immediately transferred him to indefinite detention.
He has every reason to feel persecuted, regardless of the truth of the allegations.
Absolutely.
And his official governmental risk status remains actively confirmed. He's listed in the Ministry of Justice's Register of Perpetrators of Sexual Crimes, and that status was last confirmed as recently as September 17, 2025.
So that date confirms that legally and medically, years after his sentence expired, Leszek Pękalski is still categorized as a severe active threat to public safety.
There's no question about it.
The legal system may have been constrained in the 1990s by those transitional limitations, but modern Polish law enforcement has not given up.
No, not on the dozens of victims whose cases remain unsolved. They are actively seeking to close the gap between the confession of 80 and the conviction of 1.
Which is where we get a significant modern investigative update.
Right. Near the end of Pękalski's sentence, starting around 2016, the regional prosecutor's office in Gdańsk and a specialized dedicated unit known informally as Archive X.
The undetected crimes team of the provincial police headquarters in Gdańsk.
Yes, they returned to the case with renewed vigor.
So Archive X is essentially Poland's equivalent of a dedicated advanced cold case unit.
Specifically mandated to crack open historical files that previously yielded no results.
And their specific goal regarding Pękalski's file.
Their mandate was crucial, to re-examine all unsolved past crimes, particularly those involving sexual violence and murder, where the perpetrators were not detected.
And they were focusing specifically on cases that align geographically with his nomadic train-hopping route and the vague details from his retracted confessions.
Critically, yes. And they were now armed with forensic tools that the original investigators in the early 1990s could only dream of.
This means revisiting old evidence and traces items that may have been poorly preserved or deemed irrelevant 30 years ago, and using modern DNA extraction and material analysis.
They are hoping to find that single molecular strand of evidence that definitively links Pękalski to the remaining victims, thereby securing a long overdue measure of justice and finally resolving the full scale of his terror.
And the very fact that these specialized cold case teams are still actively investing resources into Pękalski years after his trial, it confirms the institutional consensus.
It does. Despite the single conviction, the authorities and the Polish public believe the 17, or even the terrifying 80, confessions hold a kernel of terrifying truth that must be forensically confirmed.
This legacy of unproven guilt is the defining, corrosive feature of the Leszek Pękalski case.
He really is.
It forces the system to confront its historical limitations, and it speaks volumes about the immense challenges faced by justice when dealing with complex, multi-jurisdictional crimes committed by a person with diminished capacity who strategically retracts his statements.
The state knows he is dangerous and likely guilty of far more, yet the constraint of legal proof means that for perhaps 79 families, justice, in a traditional sense, has never been achieved.
So the ongoing ArchiveX efforts are a crucial contemporary attempt to reconcile that historical failure using contemporary science to finally bridge that evidentiary chasm.
It's their only hope, really.
So this deep dive has focused on the terrifying scale of the terror and the legal failure to secure convictions that were commensurate with the confessed crimes. We've covered the deeply fractured background, the extreme social rejection that isolated him, the confusing legal timeline around the reinstatement of life imprisonment in Poland, and his current status in perpetual preventive detention at Gostynin.
We've seen how Pękalski, a lightly disabled, socially rejected man from a broken home, exploited the instability and fragmented law enforcement structure of 1980s and early 1990s Poland to operate as an untraceable ghost for nearly a decade.
And the contrast between the 80 to 90 alleged victims and the final one-count conviction remains the most important and terrifying statistic of this entire case.
It is a statistical monument to the difficulty of achieving justice in a transitional state struggling to modernize its legal instruments.
It certainly highlights the difference between suspicion and legal proof, and the profound, enduring consequences of that gap for both the accused and the dozens of victims' families still waiting for closure.
And that's what it comes down to. This case forces us to confront the limitations of justice itself.
How so?
Well, if one individual is responsible for a possible 80 to 90 murders, but only one can be proven, does the measure of their 25-year punishment, followed by civil detention, truly reflect the magnitude of the horror they inflicted?
A difficult question.
And for the families of the other victims, what definition of justice can ever be achieved when the perpetrator is physically confined by the state, but legally absent from the crimes committed against their loved ones?
A question with no easy answer.
This is the dark, unresolved question left hanging over the Polish legal system, and the name Leszek Pękalski. It's a question that will only find its full answer if the ArchiveX teams can finally link the traces of the past to the man confined today.